Welcome to EPG Padashala. This module is titled Values and Uses of Biodiversity. As you see, values is the term that used to refer the services, and the goods, that is actually the uses of the biodiversity. So the values and uses are nothing but goods and services of the biodiversity. So what are the tangible goods that the biodiversity is giving to the humanity, and what are the services that the biodiversity is actually giving to the humanity? So those kind of things that we will cover in this particular module. As you see, the goods of the biodiversity, the number of tangible goods and products that the humanities depend upon. For example, you might have had the breakfast in the morning, or the food that we eat are all coming from the biodiversity, right? So either plant or the animal products, dairy product for example, or insects, honey. You might have you might have taken a public transportation or drove your car. So, you need fossil fuel. So the fossil fuel are also product of the biodiversity, that we will see that in this particular module. And the drugs, almost 90% of the whole drugs came directly from the plants or animals. So the biodiversity is immensely useful for all these things, and number of industrial products as well. Other than these goods, there are several services offered by the biodiversity. One excellent example is the air we breathe. You see, the air has got a lot of oxygen, right? So 65%, more than 65% of the oxygen in the air that we breathe comes from phytoplanktons in the ocean. So these inconspicuous, little overlooked marine creatures, these are phytoplanktons. These are bacteria that lives on the surface layers of the world's oceanic waters. They produce a majority of the oxygen that we breathe. So we normally we never knew that this particular thing, but these are actually the services that the the world's biodiversity is offering to the humanity. There are several such services that the biodiversity is offering. For example, a number of global biogeochemical cycles. These are all services. So we will see all these particular goods and services. So services also include cultural benefits, tangible or intangible cultural benefit. For example, spirituality or music, literature, arts, even bequest values, or existential values. All these we will see in this today's module. So let us first see the introduction. As you know, the biodiversity is extremely important for the health and well-being of organisms, including the human beings. However, we know only the tip of the global biodiversity. It's estimated that almost 90% of the whole biodiversity of planet Earth remain unknown. So it's like a massive iceberg. Majority of the iceberg remains unknown to us. So it remains to be discovered. So as of today, there are almost 2 million known species on the planet. So the whole planet is, whole biodiversity of the planet Earth is believed to be around 8.7 million, excluding unculturable prokaryotes. So if you include the prokaryotes, that is bacteria, the total number is almost 1 trillion. So almost like 0.001% of that whole biodiversity is only what we have characterized till date. So majority of the global biodiversity is remain to be characterized. So we never know the potential uses of those biodiversity. So only 10,000 can be cultured. That is yet another problem with this biodiversity characterization of the bacterial diversity. So only 10,000 species of bacteria can be cultured. So if you want to study about the real biodiversity of bacteria, you have to use environmental DNA metagenomic approach. So if you look at those kind of approach studies, so the meta-analysis of all these studies, a famous paper published recently, they concluded that the total unknown biodiversity of planet Earth is approximately 1 trillion. So what is the difference between ecosystem and biodiversity? So ecosystem consists of the biologically interacting organisms as well as the physical environment. So that physical environment attribute is missing in the case of biodiversity. So biodiversity deals only with the diversity of organisms, especially the species diversity, because the species is the basic unit of biodiversity as well as taxonomy. Biodiversity, rather biasly or skewly, they actually look at the species level diversity. What is the difference here? Values and uses of biodiversity. Values refer the intangible, indirect uses of biodiversity. Also ecosystem services, that is a synonymous term for the values of biodiversity, ecosystem services. Uses refer tangible, direct utility of the biodiversity. What is actually the use of this biodiversity? For example, the food that we eat or the drugs that we use to cure our disease. So all these are the synonymous term for this particular uses is ecosystem goods. So ecosystem goods and services is the same thing that values and uses of the biodiversity. Let us first look at the various goods or the uses of the biodiversity. Obvious uses is the food that we eat. So the crops, agriculture, animal domestication for the dairy, meat, poultry, fish, honey, etc. All these constitute the food that the humanity is dependent upon. Not merely humanity, but all the biological diversity, all the organisms inhabiting the planet Earth is directly dependent upon the biodiversity for the food. So more biodiversity means better for the sustenance of the organisms. Forage, fodder as well. Food additives, the number of food additives is obtained from the natural resources. For example, agar or carrageenan, these are obtained from seaweeds. Natural food colorants, natural food preservatives, all these are actually commodities obtained from the global biodiversity. Fossil fuel is also, produced by the global biodiversity, although it is indirect. Coal and petroleum were originally these were biomasses. Coal is a biomass of the terrestrial plants, while the petroleum or the crude oil had been a biomass of the marine phytoplanktons. Energy of the fossil fuel originally came from the photosynthesis of the plants. So the energy that we burn and we release back to the atmosphere while you drive a car, the CO2 going out of the atmosphere. Originally, each of the CO2 molecules as well as carbon monoxide molecules were synthesized by photosynthesis of those phytoplanktons or the terrestrial plants over millions of years ago. So the supply of the fossil fuel is extremely limited because the process of formation of this fossil fuel takes millions of years. So it is extremely limited, and the world's fossil fuel is rapidly shrinking. That is actually it's a extremely diminishing resource. You cannot actually renew. These are non-renewable resources of fossil fuels. In health as well, a number of goods came directly from the biodiversity. For example, in the case of medicine, more than 50% of all drugs came from the biodiversity, mostly from the plant-based resources. And more than 80% of the world depends upon the plants as well as animal for treatment, if you include alternate medicine as well, because most of the alternate medicines are herbal remedies. So beside medicine, cosmetic products as well, for example, the sunscreen, these SPF, the sunscreens are mostly coming from the marine resources as well. So different cosmetic products, the perfumes or nutraceutical, all these are actually coming from the global diversity. There are several industry products as well. Some of the examples include timber, paper, straw. All these are coming from plant resources, especially lignin-based woody plants. Textiles, cotton and silk are coming from the global biodiversity. Biodegradable biopolymer or leather, rubber, natural pigments, anti-fouling paints, glues, and various jewelry. For example, ivory, pearl from the pearl oysters, ambergris from the whale, or perfumes, for example, musk, ambergris, essential oils, sandalwood, etc. All these coming from the global biodiversity. So uses are immense. There are several other resources that is provided by the global biodiversity. These resources include genes. For example, number of genes that provide disease resistance as well as stress resistance or high yielding. These genes can be obtained from the organisms and can be cloned into genetically modified organisms. It could be plants or animals. So these resources are also valuable. Genes coding for enzymes, biochemical as well as drugs. One example could be insulin. The genes coding for the insulin can be obtained from human pancreas, and this can be cloned into E. coli, and this can be produced en masse for the commercial production of the insulin that we use often. Biomimetics and bionics, these are imitating the nature. For example, Velcro, that the product was developed by a researcher, the Austin researcher. He was actually an engineer who went for a morning walk, so in the field along with his puppy. So he found certain seed molecule clinged on to his coat as well as on the furs of his dog. So he obtained, further research revealed that this particular interaction of this seed as well as structure, so that inspired him to develop the product, the Velcro, that we use, that fastening, fastening band. Even airplane is a product of human ingenuity, or a product of the curiosity driven research. So the prototype of the airplane, ornithopter, was designed by Leonardo da Vinci. It is an imitation of how the birds fly. So nature assisted synthetic products from the natural scaffold is also, of course, these are immense utility in the field of pharmaceuticals. So these are also other resources. There are several values offered by the biodiversity of the world. The values are services. So it can be grouped into 4 types. So provisioning services, supporting services, regulatory services, or cultural services. First is provisional services. These are renewable resources that the humanity is dependent upon. So all goods discussed earlier comes under the provisional services, as well as a very important provisional service is the pollination by the pollinators, the insect pollinators, also the bird pollinators. Pollination is of immense use for the agriculture. One estimate says that 14.6 billion US dollar annually worldwide, that is the value of the pollination, the inconspicuous service offered by the global biodiversity. And most of the pollination, of course, almost like 99% of the pollination is done by insects or the birds. Other supporting services include primary production by the plants. Of course, only the plants have the ability to photosynthesize, while a subsection called chemosynthesis do happen in hydrothermal vents as well as in subterranean environment by the bacteria, but almost the entire photosynthesis on the planet Earth is by photosynthesis by the plants. Nutrient recycling through the global biogeochemical cycles, for example, biogeochemical cycles of the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on, are directly dependent upon the global biodiversity. Soil formation is also a process where the biodiversity plays key role. For example, lichens are specialized, they actually they are involved with the weathering of the rocks. And earthworms are, of course, important for the soil formation, as well as detritus decomposers, the various fungal components of the soil. Habitat refugation is a term that uses that the biodiversity provides specialized habitats for sustenance of further biodiversity. One example is seaweed beds. So this is actually a habitat produced by the seaweeds underneath the global ocean. So seagrass meadows is yet another example of this sort of specialized biologically mediated habitats. Coral reefs, tropical rainforest, etc. Even human body is home to over 100 trillion microorganisms. These natural microflora is not merely confined to our own human body, but also for plants, animals, and fungus, etc. This is revealing the utility of this microflora is being revealed by a number of recent studies. Regulatory services include services that regulate major ecosystem processes. For example, oxygen generation. As I explained to you earlier, over 65% of the oxygen in the air that we breathe are produced by the marine phytoplanktons. So these services are tremendously useful for the entire life on planet Earth. All the aerobic life on the planet Earth is directly dependent upon the oxygen in the air that we breathe. So this oxygen is produced by the phytoplanktons. Carbon dioxide sequestration, removal of the CO2 from the atmosphere via photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, as you know, it fixes the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to sugars. And recently, algae and other aquatic organisms are being now used as or potentially explored their utility as mitigation measures for global warming. So use of algae for the climate change mitigation through the carbon dioxide sequestration, because algae can sequester, they can actually fix the CO2, they can remove the CO2 from the atmosphere and fix that into simple sugars. CO2 production by the ruminants, a number of ruminants, for example the cattle, and non-ruminants, small insects as well, for example ants. Ants do have compartmentalized stomach where they have a number of methanogenic bacteria that release the CO2 to the atmosphere. So the carbon dioxide production by the cattle as well as the ruminant organisms is a contributing factor, contributing to the global warming. It's not merely CO2 but also the methane. Now, methane is also a greenhouse gas. Regulating services includes purification of air and water. Several plants have the ability to purify the air. So it is incorrect to say that the trees they can purify the all pollutants, but they do have, certain plants do have ability to remove the toxic substances from the air as well as from the water. Wetlands naturally purify the water by removing excess nutrient load. That this nutrient load comes from the upstreams of the river, and most of these nutrient loads are being removed by the wetlands before being discharged into the coastal region. So if you remove these wetlands, if you change the habitat, if you construct the wetland, if you reclaim this wetland, the nutrient load is no more being removed from the riverine systems, and this excessive nutrient load will lead to eutrophication in the coastal region that wreaks havoc on the marine coastal biodiversity. So wetlands as well as flood plains, they buffer against disturbance perturbation. So especially for the flood, if you convert these flood plains into human inhabitable regions, so the flood becomes a prominent feature. So this biodiversity actually provide a number of advantages for disturbance regimes as well by providing themselves as a buffer. Regulating services also include many plant species that are hyper-accumulators of the heavy metals. These have the potential to use in the phytoremediation. The phytoremediation is usage of the plant material for removal of the toxic substances from the environment. For example, sunflower can accumulate arsenic, willow tree can accumulate cadmium, Indian mustard and poplar trees can accumulate lead, etc. So these are some of the examples of the hyperaccumulators. Bioaugmentation. The term bioaugmentation is used to refer when bacteria or microalgal cultures are used to speed up the degradation of the contaminant. One example is the municipal sewage treatment plants. These plants employ trickling filters that contains a biofilm of the microorganisms. So here the biofilm of microorganism is being used to remove the excess nutrients from the industrial sewage. Bacteria as well as genetically engineered organisms for oil spill cleanup. This is yet another example of the bioaugmentation. Biological control. Even in the biological control, though, of course, we are highly dependent upon the biodiversity. Some examples include to control the rat infestation. Traditional humanity has been used, employed by the cats. Ladybugs is used for the aphids. Parasitoid wasp introduced to control the greenhouse white fly. And predatory mite introduced to control the spider mite infestation. Other examples involving microorganisms include entomopathogenic fungi, widely used to control the pest aphid, and baculoviruses to control various insect pests. So biocontrol through GMO containing responsible genes is also a viable strategy for biocontrol. Examples include Bt gene that is cloned into various genetic resources, for example Bt cotton, Bt maize, Bt tobacco, etc. So this Bt, the name comes from Bacillus thuringiensis, the bacteria that has a gene called cry gene encodes crystal protein delta endotoxin. So this particular protein is specifically toxic to a number of insect species, while this particular protein is not at all toxic to the human consumption. So Bt, for example, Bt brinjal, there is no harm that we get if we consume it, but it is specifically targeted to the insect species, so it actually dies. Of late, a system called integrated pest management system is what the researchers potentially make use of instead of simple biocontrol. It's a management system. What is the difference here? The community ecology is also regarded with due care and prime importance. So integrated pest management system is not targeted for the total eradication, but to control. So the aim of IPMS is to control or sustainably control the pest, not the total eradication. It also, IPMS also involve acceptable levels of pesticides as well as levels of pests in the field or use of the pesticide. So responsible use of pesticide is involved in this IPMS strategy. So it is a combined approach that involves various alternate strategies including biocontrol, synthetic pesticides, mechanical control, cultural practices, etc. for the management of the pest. So that is extremely important. So there is a very interesting term in the community ecology, that is something called portfolio effect. So portfolio effect is that that actually analogous to the portfolios in a stock market. So a good portfolio in mutual fund is the one that contains various funds, high risk funds or low risk fund, all kinds of portfolio. So this balanced portfolio is good. Why? Because it is resilient. It can spring back from huge impacts. Similarly, a community including mixed species from various trophic levels, primary producers, consumers, all these different kinds of a mixed community is more resilient. So crop monoculture that has been in use traditionally, even now majority of crop fields are monoculture. Now the trend is to investigate the polyculture, so the culture of the crops along with the different other varieties of the plants. So instead of going for the traditional aquaculture, the trend these days is to investigate the possibility of multi-trophic aquaculture. So IMTA, so that's a new trend in aquaculture. What is this IMTA is all about? A number of seaweed species are deliberately introduced into the shrimp or fish aquaculture systems. So that can assimilate the excess inorganic nutrients, so that the nutrient load is a major problem in these aquaculture fields. So we excessively pump in the nutrients, so that causes eutrophication. So instead of that, we have to remove these inorganic nutrients from these fields by deliberate introduction of certain key seaweed species that do not bloom. A number of shellfish species, for example abalone, are introduced to this particular fish aquaculture fields to extract the organic nutrient load, for example fish excrements. So the nutrient load could be organic or inorganic. The inorganic nutrient load can be assimilated by the deliberate introduction of seaweed, while organic nutrient load you need to have certain detritus feeders, for example abalone. Excess nutrients have effectively being used by other trophic levels, sequestered. The problems such as eutrophication can be prevented if this excess nutrient load is effectively being sequestered by other trophic levels. Number of filter feeders such as caprophagous organisms. Caprophagy means organisms that can assimilate the excreta. Decomposers Detrivores such as fungi can also be introduced part of this system. So such a system is more balanced, resilient, stable, and is more economical, as the fishermen can as well harvest the abalones and seaweeds in addition to the fish or shrimps. So in traditional aquaculture feeds, the only viable commercial product is the fish. But in this IMTA model, it's not merely fish, but the fisherman can sell the seaweed products as well as abalone and other products. So there are several cultural services are also being offered by the global biodiversity. The cultural services include tourism, for example, nature hikes, cruises, bird or butterfly watching, ecotourism and agri-tourism. All these activities are directly linked with global biodiversity. So if the biodiversity is impacted, it will have huge repercussions on the tourism industry as well. Several hobby groups, for example, gardening or fish keeping, specimen collecting, all these will be impacted if the biodiversity is not being preserved well. So as a spirituality as well, there are several nature-based or nature-worshipping pagan religions in the world. For example, Hinduism or Japanese Shintoism or ancient Egyptian Kemeticism are all nature-worshipping religions. And most of these religious as well as other spiritual traditions and philosophies do have embedded the nature conservation scenarios in their system. For example, the sacred groves of Hinduism that you can see it in South India as well as in the Northeast India, that has certain groves, untouched groves, that is an epitome of nature conservation. Liberal arts, performing arts, painters, sculptures, music, literature, all are being benefited, all are being inspired by our natural resources. In addition, world's biodiversity do have bequest value. So the term bequest value refers that these resources might not have immediate uses of today, but it might be having immense use in the future. So we have a number of species being discovered each and every day. So these species might not have immediate impacts on humanity, but it might have potential uses in future. So the future value, that is called the bequest value. In addition, the global biodiversity also have existential value. The term existential value refers that these are valuable simply because they exist, just for the sake of knowing its existence. For example, a number of people all around the world have never been to tropical rainforest, or they have never been to to tropical coral reef, for example, Great Barrier Reef. They might have seen this Great Barrier Reef through excellent documentaries, through interesting channel, for example, National Geographic or Discovery Channel, and they know that these resources are important. So there is actually the existential value. So in case these particular locations are affected, so they feel sadness. So that particular value is called existential value. So the value simply for the sake of knowing its existence. So in summary, at present we know only a very, very small part of the global biodiversity, almost 99% of the global biodiversity remains to be explored. So yet it is clear that the biodiversity has immense uses and values that has ramifications on every part of the human existence. Global biodiversity is immensely useful for the humanity as it produces several renewable goods such as food, fodder, foliage, drugs, cosmetic products, nutraceutical products, wood, paper, rubber, leather, perfumes, and so on. World's non-renewable fossil energy resources are also a product of the biodiversity. As the rate of production is extremely slow, petroleum resources of the world are rapidly diminishing. Apart from tangible goods, biodiversity also is useful to the humanity in a number of other ways, including various services that it offers. So services can arbitrarily be grouped into four as provisioning services, regulatory services, supporting services, or cultural services. So perhaps the most important among the services of the biodiversity is the global biogeochemical cycles, as well as the production of oxygen, combined with natural sequestration of the carbon dioxide. Another service with huge economical ramification is pollination. A mixed community involving multi-trophic level ecological niche is far superior, resilient and stable compared with a monoculture, the cultivation of just one species, as commonly used in agriculture or aquaculture these days. So integrated multiculture aquaculture, multi-trophic aquaculture is an example of such a polyculture system in aquaculture. So polyculture system is also used for agriculture as well, especially in the crops. Biodiversity also provides several cultural values such as inspiring artisans, writers, painters, sculptors, musicians and so on. A number of world's pagan belief systems have inbuilt biodiversity conservation elements. For example, sacred groves of India, for example. So in summary, the biodiversity is highly valuable. So it has an immense use as well as values. So because the biodiversity has a number of tangible products, for example, foods and drugs, and intangible products, for example, the air that we breathe has a lot of oxygen that is being produced by the biodiversity. Also, global biogeochemical cycles and various inconspicuous services that the biodiversity offers to humanity include spiritual services as well as ecotourism, and existential and bequest values. So in summary, global biodiversity is extremely important for the humanity, and it's our duty to preserve the world's biodiversity. Thank you.